On the night of May 14th, 2026, Russia launched the largest coordinated strike of the entire war. Over 1,500 drones, 64 missiles, a single night. Ukraine's air defense intercepted 93% of them, and 9 people still died. 40 more were wounded. 20 were pulled from rubble in buildings that had no military purpose whatsoever. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. In the 72 hours before that strike, Moscow was broadcasting a single diplomatic message to every channel that would carry it. We want peace. We are willing to talk. Ukraine must consider negotiations. Peace rhetoric. Then 1,500 drones through civilian windows, simultaneously. Most people looked at that and saw a contradiction, a mixed message, maybe a negotiating tactic, maybe an internal miscommunication between Russian diplomatic and military chains of command. It was none of those things. What happened on May 14th was not a contradiction. It was a confession. And once you understand what Russia was actually confessing and why, you will never look at Vladimir Putin's strategic position the same way again. This is Flash America, and today we are going to do something that almost nobody in mainstream coverage has done with this story. We are not going to describe what happened. We are going to decode it. We are going to tell you what the May 14th strike actually reveals about where Russia is right now, how deep the trap Putin has walked himself into truly goes, and why the most dangerous moment of this entire war may not be when Russia is strong, but precisely when it is not. Stay with me, because by the time we finish, you are going to understand this conflict at a level that most analysts are not delivering. Let's start with the strike itself, because the target selection is the first clue, and it is hiding in plain sight. Russia's May 14th strike targeted a 9-story residential apartment complex. That by itself is not new. Russia has been hitting civilian infrastructure throughout this war, but the location of this particular building matters enormously, and almost no coverage has focused on it. The building sits on the main road from Boryspil International Airport into Kyiv. That road is not a logistics corridor. It is not a military supply route. It is not a strategic communications hub. It is the entry road for international visitors, for diplomats, for journalists, for the delegations of foreign governments that fly into Kyiv to assess the war, to meet with Zelensky, to coordinate military and economic support for Ukraine. Street-level analysis confirmed what satellite imagery already showed: a civilian market, standard Ukrainian municipal buses, children's play areas within the blast radius, no military infrastructure of any kind. This is the most internationally visible civilian approach corridor in the Ukrainian capital, and Russia chose it. Now ask yourself the question that the diplomatic framing is specifically designed to prevent you from asking. Why would a force that is winning, a force that is confident in its military position, that believes the outcome of this war is moving in its favor, why would that force choose, at the exact moment it is broadcasting peace overtures to the world, to strike the building most visible to the international observers it claims to want to negotiate with? A force that is genuinely advancing does not need to prove it can inflict suffering. A confident victor does not demonstrate capacity through residential buildings. A strategic actor that believes the arc of this conflict is bending toward its desired outcome does not launch the largest single strike of the entire war against a 9-story apartment block on a diplomat road. That is not strategy. That is panic wearing the mask of strength. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand why Putin is panicking, and he is panicking, regardless of what state media says, you need to understand the architecture of the trap he has built around himself. Because it has 3 walls, and they are all closing in at the same time. The first wall is territorial. For most of this war, Russia could point to a territorial ledger and claim it was moving in the right direction. Slow, bloody, costly, but moving. February 2026 changed that. February 2026 was the first month since 2024 in which Ukraine recovered more territory than it yielded. Ukraine recaptured 285 square kilometers in the Oleksandrivka direction alone in a single operational push. The meat grinder continues. The casualty rates continue. But the territorial ledger, which was supposed to be the living evidence of Russian inevitability, has flipped. For a military operation built on the political premise of restoration, of Russian greatness, of correcting the historical mistake of Soviet collapse, a net negative territorial balance is not a tactical problem. It is an existential one. It means the entire story Putin has been selling to the Russian people, the story that justifies every death, every cost, every sacrifice, is demonstrably, measurably false. The second wall is manpower. The idea of infinite Russian manpower, that sheer population size and the willingness to conscript endlessly would eventually exhaust Ukrainian resistance, has been the foundation of Putin's long game from the beginning. The data is now methodically dismantling that foundation. Russia's prison population has decreased by 40%. Those men did not receive pardons. They were conscripted and sent into frontal assaults that consumed them. Ukrainian military intelligence, corroborated by NATO assessments, estimates Russia is suffering between 1,200 and 1,500 casualties per day. Over a full year, that translates to more than 400,000 personnel losses against a total active military strength of approximately 1.3 million. The math does not work, and it gets worse. The quality of replacements is declining faster than the quantity. In the early stages of the invasion, Russia could deploy trained reserve personnel with actual military experience. Now it is deploying men who have received weeks of preparation, who have never held a command position, who arrive at the front with inadequate equipment and inadequate training. The force is nominally the same size on paper. Its actual combat effectiveness is a fraction of what it was when this war began. The third wall is narrative, and this one may be the most dangerous of all. For years, Vladimir Putin has built a mythology around himself, the restorer of Russian greatness, the man who bends history to his will, the leader who corrects what he calls the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That mythology is not just a political asset. It is the structural, load-bearing wall of his entire domestic support system. And it has created an impossible trap. He cannot negotiate without destroying the mythology. He cannot accept a frozen conflict that the world reads as a stalemate, because stalemate means he did not win, and a man who promised to win cannot admit he did not. He cannot sign a ceasefire that international observers interpret as Russian failure without explaining to a domestic audience that has been told for 2 years that Russia is winning, what all the corpses were actually for. There is no clean exit. There is no version of this that preserves the myth intact. So what does a leader do when every path forward carries a devastating cost? He demonstrates. He performs. He sends 1,500 drones in a single night to show everyone, the Russian domestic audience, the international community, the European governments debating aid packages, the American administration still defining its posture, that despite everything, the machine still functions, that Russia is still capable of delivering overwhelming force, that the war is not lost. And here is the insight that the entire analysis turns on. The demonstration is itself the evidence of weakness. Read that again. The demonstration is the evidence of weakness. A force that is genuinely winning does not need to terrorize civilians to prove it is winning. A strategic actor that is confident in its position does not simultaneously broadcast peace rhetoric and deliver maximum bombardment through residential windows. The need to demonstrate capacity is the confession that the position is more fragile than the demonstration claims. Putin's war machine still kills. That is true. But it no longer convinces. It no longer projects inevitability. It no longer makes the international community believe that the outcome is predetermined. And that transition from killing machine to performing machine is the moment when military power begins its shift from strategic asset to strategic liability. The scale of the strike on May 14th was not evidence of Russian strength. It was inversely proportional to the confidence behind it. The bigger the performance, the weaker the position it was designed to conceal. Now, let's talk about who else was in the room when that strike landed. Because Russia did not just hit Kyiv on May 14th. It hit 3 external actors simultaneously. And the international dimension of this strike is receiving almost no analytical attention. The first actor is the European diplomatic community. The strike came precisely as European foreign ministers were coordinating their response to Russia's peace overtures, working through what a potential dialogue framework might look like, internally debating the pace and scale of continued military support for Ukraine. The timing was not coincidental. Putin was communicating to every European capital simultaneously. Whatever framework you are constructing, whatever compromise you are considering, Russia's definition of acceptable terms has not changed. The 1,500 drones were the punctuation mark on a diplomatic sentence, and it worked in the opposite direction from what Moscow intended. Several governments that had been internally debating whether to slow or condition their military support for Ukraine reported immediate internal shifts after May 14th. The pressure for continued support hardened, not softened. The strike unified the European diplomatic community in ways that months of Ukrainian lobbying had struggled to achieve. The second actor is China. Beijing has spent this entire war maintaining a carefully managed equivocation, never explicitly endorsing the invasion, never effectively condemning it, positioning itself as a potential neutral mediator while continuing to provide economic support that sustains Russia's war capacity. It is a sophisticated diplomatic position, and it has served Chinese interests well. The May 14th strike threatens that position directly. China cannot simultaneously claim to be a credible neutral mediator and remain publicly silent about a strike of this scale on civilian infrastructure. It cannot maintain the fiction of impartiality, while its economic support enables the very military capacity that produced 1,500 drones over a residential building. The strike forces Beijing to recalibrate, to find new language, to constrain its diplomatic flexibility in ways it did not anticipate. Russia handed China a problem it did not need. The third actor is the American administration. The strike arrived at a moment when United States diplomatic posture toward the conflict was still being actively defined, when different factions within the administration were arguing over the appropriate framework for American engagement. A strike of this scale and visibility does not simplify any negotiating position. It complicates every one of them. It makes any American signal of openness to Russian terms politically radioactive in the immediate aftermath. It narrows the space for the kind of diplomatic maneuvering that Moscow was presumably trying to create with its simultaneous peace rhetoric. Russia launched 1,500 drones and managed to harden European support, complicate Chinese positioning, and constrain American diplomatic flexibility, all in a single night. That is a remarkable achievement in counterproductive strategic communication. Now let us talk about the clocks, because this is where the structural asymmetry of this conflict becomes most visible and most consequential. What defeats a cornered adversary is not a single overwhelming blow. What defeats a cornered adversary is multiple simultaneous pressures running at different speeds, each expiring on its own timeline, none individually fatal, but collectively irresistible. Vladimir Putin has 4 clocks running against him right now. He controls the pace of none of them. The first clock is energy infrastructure. Ukraine's power grid has been the systematic target of Russian strikes since early in the war. Generating capacity has been degraded significantly, but Ukraine has been repairing, rebuilding, and diversifying its energy sources continuously, with Poland, Romania, and EU emergency infrastructure supplying backup capacity that simply did not exist 18 months ago. The window in which destroying Ukraine's energy grid could actually break Ukrainian civilian resilience, could actually make the population demand an end to the war on Russian terms, is closing. By late summer, when heating demand drops and the grid operates at reduced load, strikes on energy infrastructure become tactically irrelevant to civilian morale. Putin's window on this clock runs until approximately October 2026. That is not a long window. The second clock is manpower. At 1,200 to 1,500 casualties per day, Russia is consuming its trained military personnel faster than it can produce equivalently capable replacements. The prison recruitment pool has been largely exhausted. A 40% reduction in the prison population confirms this mathematically. The next tier of conscription reaches deeper into civilian life, into regions that previously had exemptions, into demographics that signal to Russian families everywhere that the war is not going as described on state television. This clock does not expire in months. It runs in years, but it is running, and it cannot be stopped without stopping the war. The third clock is economic. Russia is officially spending approximately 6% of GDP on military operations. Unofficial estimates reach as high as 15%. The ruble has weakened, inflation has increased. The technology sector has been structurally crippled by sanctions on components and expertise. Russia has demonstrated economic resilience through import substitution and redirected trade through Turkey, the UAE, and China. But resilience is not sustainability. There is a difference between surviving under pressure and thriving under it. This clock runs in years, not months, but it is running without pause. The fourth clock, and this is the one that almost nobody is discussing, is the internal political clock. There is no evidence of mass anti-war sentiment surfacing in Russian society. State control of information prevents that from surfacing publicly. But there is evidence of something quieter, and in many ways more dangerous: war fatigue among the elite. Anxiety about casualty figures among the siloviki, the security and military establishment, who have access to the real numbers, not the curated numbers that appear on state television. Uncertainty about the end state among regional governors who are managing the social consequences of increasingly aggressive conscription drives in their regions. As the war continues without clear progress, as the territorial ledger fails to show the advances that state media has been promising, as the casualty figures become impossible to hide from families who stop receiving sons and brothers and fathers, this clock accelerates. And unlike the other three, it is not linear. Internal political pressure can move very slowly for a very long time and then shift with sudden, unpredictable speed. Ukraine has one primary clock, the clock of international support. That clock is running slower than any of Putin's 4 internal clocks. That asymmetry, one Ukrainian clock against 4 Russian clocks, is the structural advantage that this conflict's ultimate outcome will turn on. Here is something that almost nobody in Western analysis is saying clearly enough. The Russian state, which presents itself to the outside world as a unified will executing a unified strategy, contains at minimum 4 internal factions whose interests are beginning to diverge under the pressure of a war that is not resolving on the timeline any of them anticipated. The first faction is the siloviki, the security and military establishment. These are the men who have benefited most from the war economy, the defense contracts, the consolidated political power, the institutional expansion of the FSB and GRU under wartime conditions. They have every structural incentive to continue the war, but they also have the clearest, unfiltered view of the actual military situation because they receive the real casualty figures, the real territorial maps, the real logistics assessments. The gap between what they know and what they publicly claim has been widening for 18 months. That gap does not close without a reckoning. The second faction is the oligarch and business elite. They have partially adapted to the sanctions environment, finding alternative trade through Turkey, the UAE, and China. The war has been costly for them, but not yet existential. As the economic clock accelerates, that calculation changes. Some are already quietly questioning the war's sustainability. Not publicly, because the consequences of public questioning in Russia are well understood. But the questions are being asked inside the networks that matter. The third faction is the regional governors and internal security forces. Their operational responsibility has shifted. They are no longer just administering regions. They are managing conscription drives in populations that are increasingly aware the war is not going as described. They are suppressing resistance to draft calls in ways they did not anticipate when they signed up for their positions. They are managing the social fallout of casualty figures that filter back through families, regardless of what state media reports. These governors are developing a complicated relationship with Moscow that the Kremlin cannot fully control from the center. The fourth faction is the propaganda apparatus itself. The state media editors, the television personalities, the narrative architects who have spent 2 years constructing and maintaining the story of inevitable Russian victory. This faction is the most ideologically committed to continuation of the war, because a negotiated settlement, a visible stalemate, any outcome that falls short of the victory they have been promising, does not merely end the conflict. It ends their relevance. It retroactively makes their entire function a documented fiction. They cannot admit failure without admitting themselves. They are the most invested in the mythology and the most threatened by any outcome that punctures it. These factions do not openly conflict. Open conflict in Russia's political architecture is suppressed by design. But the tensions between them are real, they are growing, and sustained external pressure, sanctions, continued military aid to Ukraine, diplomatic isolation, reinforces the factions that are quietly questioning the war by making the cost of continuation more visible and the timeline to resolution less credible with every passing month. Let us bring this back to May 14th and extract the largest lesson from it. Before that strike, it was at least arguable that Russia's diplomatic overtures represented some form of genuine, if cynical, openness to negotiation. That the peace rhetoric and the bombardment existed in tension rather than in coordination. That there was some faction inside the Kremlin that actually wanted to explore off-ramps. After May 14th, that argument is no longer available. The simultaneous delivery of 1,500 drones and peace vocabulary is not tension, it is doctrine. It is a deliberate, coordinated instrument of coercion. The message is precise, and it is not subtle. Negotiate on Russian terms or watch your cities burn. That is not negotiation. That is extortion. And treating it as anything else is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. And here is the strategic lesson that extends far beyond this conflict. To every government in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Tehran, in every capital that is watching this war to calculate what the limits of Western resolve actually are. The largest single strike of this entire war came not from a position of advancing strength. It came from a position of strategic entrapment. It came from a leader who is running out of options, running low on trained manpower, watching the territorial ledger flip against him for the first time in 2 years, facing 4 simultaneous internal clocks he cannot stop, and managing a domestic narrative that is becoming increasingly impossible to sustain. The cornered actor analogy is not rhetorical flourish. It is a precise diagnostic tool, and the diagnosis carries a specific warning. A cornered actor that is permitted to escape its trap does not become docile. It does not become grateful for the diplomatic generosity that allowed it to exit. It recalibrates, it rearms, it reinterprets the exit as a victory, and it attacks again from a stronger position, having learned exactly where the limits of Western resolve sit. Zelensky said it directly following the May 14th strike. There will be an appropriate response. That clarity matters, and the West's response must match it, not because matching it is comfortable, but because the moment pressure lifts, the moment any signal is sent that the international community is open to Russian terms, the moment Ukraine is pressured toward settlement from a position of weakness, Putin's calculation changes completely. The trap opens, and what emerges from it will not be a Russia ready for peace. Return to the opening image one final time. Peace rhetoric. Then 1,500 drones against a residential apartment building on the road that every diplomat traveling to Kyiv drives down. 9 people dead, 40 wounded, 20 pulled from rubble in a building with a children's playground within its blast radius. That is not a military decision in the traditional sense. A military decision optimizes for military outcomes. This optimized for something else, for the performance of strength at the precise moment that the underlying position is weakest, for the theater of inevitability at the precise moment the territorial ledger has flipped, for the appearance of a war that is going well, delivered by a leader who knows, from the classified figures that cross his desk, that it is not. It is a confession, written in drone strikes and residential rubble, and the world is reading it. The question, the only question that matters now, is whether the West reads it clearly enough to respond with the discipline that this moment requires. Whether the scale of the destruction produces the pressure toward compromise that Moscow is specifically trying to manufacture. Whether the trap holds, or whether it opens. That answer is not determined in Moscow. It is determined in Washington, in Brussels, in every capital that is watching what Putin does after he demonstrates and still does not win. Stay with Flash America. Subscribe now, because this situation moves every single day, and the analysis that matters, not the diplomatic framing, not the headline coverage, but the behavioral decoding that tells you what is actually happening. That is what we are here to deliver. The confession has been made. Now watch what comes next.